I'm actually stunned that anyone would use the CFPB as the paragon of virtue. The CFPB is one of the most corrupt federal agencies ever created in the history of the United States. Violates the Constitution and how it was framed. It was intentionally created so that there was no congressional oversight. It was created in such a way that Congress did not have the power of the purse over the CFPB. The Supreme Court has found both of those two aspects of the CFPB to be unconstitutional in the sense that it was not Congress that provided the funding for CFPB, but actually they basically identified their own budget receiving money from the Federal Reserve, making it impossible for the president to remove the head of the CFPB in violation of the Constitution and Article 2 of the United States Constitution. I've never seen an agency that worked harder to violate the due process rights of those businesses and entities that were the disfavored entities related to the CFPB. I watched as individuals were forced to disclose attorney-client privilege in violation of the law. I watched as they targeted, again, disfavored industries simply because they didn't like them, yet never were able to prove any kind of criminal conduct for those entities. The CFPB is exactly contrary to our very form and structure of government. I cannot imagine that anyone would hold it up as protecting us from fraudulent companies when it itself engaged in fraudulent activities. The targeting of individuals across this country by CFPB has been an absolute tragedy. And I cannot believe anyone would claim that that is an example of a problem. What the president did in terms of addressing the CFPB was exactly what needed to be done.
This may look like a partisan clash over a single federal agency, but it's actually a deeper test of how power is supposed to function in a constitutional system. What's really being tested here is whether institutions designed to protect the public can operate without becoming unaccountable forces themselves. This raises broader questions about where oversight ends and bureaucratic authority begins. In this video, we'll break down how a fight over consumer protection became a battle over the limits of government power and who gets to enforce them.
Mr. Johnson. Gentlelady from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to associate myself with the remarks of my colleague from Pennsylvania. I'm very concerned about the extent to which the Office of Civil Rights at the DOJ has been sidelined and underfunded. And Americans do not like what they are seeing on their TV screens. They do not like it. YouGov poll that came out in the last 48 hours showing a majority of Americans disapprove of the way that ICE is conducting itself. And they do not want this to continue. They feel like it is an attack on their civil rights, and rightly so. I also want to talk about the fact that it's very difficult to sit here and take seriously any efforts regarding going after fraud from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle when one of the first things that President Trump did when he was sworn in is he went after the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an agency that is independent, and its goal is to protect U.S. consumers. That's literally its mission. And at the beginning of his second term, Trump appointed an acting director who directed the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to stop any regulatory activity and moved to fire 90% of the agency's staff. The staff that was literally standing up for Americans who had been victims of fraud and had returned $21 billion back to consumers who had been ripped off. And so we have an independent agency that was doing the work of protecting Americans from fraud, and this president decided to go after pretty much the one agency that was going to bat for all of us, preventing people from ripping us off from credit card companies, ripping us off from financial institutions and banks. So I don't know.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I certainly will. I yield to the ranking member.
It's such an excellent point you're making that they targeted the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was all about combating fraud against American consumers. But you could add to that that they sacked 17 inspector generals in all of the federal agencies whose precise job it is to ferret out waste, fraud, and abuse.
I'm so glad, Mr. Ranking Member, that you brought that up. That's exactly right. When you sideline the people, the inspectors general, whose job it is to do oversight, to ferret out fraud, and you prevent them from doing their jobs. How can we sit here and say that we're actually doing something to fight fraud? It makes no sense whatsoever. It doesn't pass the straight face test. And it's difficult for us, day in and day out. I feel like we come in here and we have to exist in some kind of upside down land. And people want us to forget the stuff that happened just a year ago from this administration, who came in gangbusters, preventing us from doing the things to protect our constituents from fraud. And then we sit here and we are asked to forget all of that. And I want to just be on the record today that what happened to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was a travesty. It was an agency that was sticking up for all of us, and it has now been hollowed out. And I don't know how you can sit here and say that you're fighting fraud when that is what has happened. Mr. Ranking Member, do you need more time?
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, what we've seen from the beginning of the administration, a dismantling of the infrastructure that is designed to combat foreign corruption, fraud. They took down the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and said that they wouldn't enforce that any further. There's been a dismantling of the governmental infrastructure against fraud and corruption. So now, essentially, they want to take all of these crimes whose prosecution and whose investigation they've neutered in the government, and then suddenly revive attention to it simply through the immigrants and the immigration system. And I think it's a pathetic way for them to proceed, and I appreciate your yielding to me.
And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized. And the gentleman.
I'm actually stunned that anyone would use the CFPB as the paragon of virtue. The CFPB is one of the most corrupt federal agencies ever created in the history of the United States. Violates the Constitution and how it was framed. It was intentionally created so that there was no congressional oversight. It was created in such a way that Congress did not have the power of the purse over the CFPB. The Supreme Court has found both of those two aspects of the CFPB to be unconstitutional, in the sense that it was not Congress that provided the funding for CFPB, but actually they basically identified their own budget receiving money from the Federal Reserve, making it impossible for the president to remove the head of the CFPB in violation of the Constitution and Article 2 of the United States Constitution. I've never seen an agency that worked harder to violate the due process rights of those businesses and entities that were the disfavored entities related to the CFPB. I watched as individuals were forced to disclose attorney-client privilege in violation of the law. I watched as they targeted, again, disfavored industries simply because they didn't like them, yet never were able to prove any kind of criminal conduct for those entities. The CFPB is exactly contrary to our very form and structure of government. I cannot imagine that anyone would hold it up as protecting us from fraudulent companies when it itself engaged in fraudulent activities. The targeting of individuals across this country by CFPB has been an absolute tragedy. And I cannot believe anyone would claim that that is an example of a problem. What the president did in terms of addressing the CFPB was exactly what needed to be done. Thank you, and I yield back.
The room fell quiet the moment Representative Harriet Hageman leaned into her microphone and said the words that no one on the panel was expecting. "I'm actually stunned," she began, before delivering a full-throated defense of why the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the very agency just held up as a guardian of American consumers, was, in her view, one of the most deeply flawed creations in modern federal history. In that instant, what had been a predictable partisan exchange transformed into something far more revealing. A clash not just over one agency, but over the meaning of oversight, power, and who truly gets to decide how Washington governs the lives of ordinary Americans. Just moments earlier, Representative Becca Balint had laid out a dramatic case for the CFPB as a frontline defender against fraud. She spoke of billions returned to consumers, of staff dedicated to standing up to powerful financial interests, of a bureau hollowed out by a new administration that, in her telling, had chosen to weaken the very systems designed to protect working families. Her argument was emotional, layered with public polling and moral urgency. But Hageman's response did not meet that emotion with retreat. Instead, it met it head-on with a constitutional challenge that cut to the core of how this country is supposed to function. What Hageman put on the table was not a technical dispute. It was a philosophical confrontation. She argued that the CFPB was designed in a way that deliberately bypassed Congress, the branch entrusted by the Constitution with the power of the purse and the responsibility of oversight, funding drawn directly from the Federal Reserve, leadership insulated from removal, an agency operating beyond the reach of the elected representatives of the people. To her, that was not independence. It was unaccountability. And in a republic built on checks and balances, unaccountable power is always a warning sign. This is the moment that matters. Not because one side praised the CFPB and the other condemned it, but because it exposed two radically different visions of governance. One sees strong, independent agencies as shields protecting citizens from powerful interests. The other sees those same agencies as unchecked bureaucracies, capable of wielding enormous power without democratic consent. When Hageman cited Supreme Court rulings that found key elements of the CFPB's structure unconstitutional, she wasn't just making a legal argument, she was making a moral one. That even well-intended institutions can become dangerous when they operate outside the framework of accountability. And that tension is at the heart of today's political crisis. Americans want fairness. They want protection from financial misconduct. They want to believe that someone in Washington is standing up for them. But they also want to know that those wielding power are themselves constrained by law, transparency, and the consent of the governed. When agencies operate in the shadows of technical complexity, when their budgets are self-assigned, when their leaders are insulated from removal, trust erodes. Not because people oppose regulation, but because they sense something deeper is wrong. Hageman's description of due process violations, of businesses forced to surrender protected communications, of entire industries labeled disfavored without clear evidence, goes to that fear. Whether one agrees with her conclusions or not, the allegation itself strikes at something fundamental. That power, once unleashed without firm limits, will eventually be misused. History teaches this again and again. Systems built to protect can become systems that punish. Structures created to serve the public can drift into serving themselves. This exchange also reveals the way Washington often talks past itself. While Balint framed the CFPB as a lifeline for consumers, Hageman framed it as an agency that had itself become a source of injustice. Both were speaking to real anxieties. Americans do worry about financial exploitation. They also worry about faceless institutions making life-altering decisions without recourse. The tragedy is that these fears are not mutually exclusive. They are two sides of the same democratic coin. What makes this moment so powerful is that it strips away the easy narratives. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that governance is not simply about good intentions, but about structure. Who controls the money? Who answers to whom? Who can be removed when things go wrong? These are not abstract questions. They determine whether a family can challenge a penalty, whether a small business can defend itself, whether a citizen has a voice when a powerful agency comes knocking. When Hageman said she could not imagine anyone holding up the CFPB as a model of virtue, she was really saying something larger, that in a free society, virtue must be anchored to accountability. Without it, even the most noble mission can drift into something else. And when she argued that the president's actions toward the CFPB were necessary, she was asserting a belief that restoring constitutional balance matters more than preserving any single institution. This is the crossroads America now faces. A country struggling to balance protection and freedom. A system wrestling with how to restrain power without abandoning responsibility. A public caught between fear of exploitation and fear of bureaucracy. These hearings are not just political theater, they are windows into the machinery of government and the competing philosophies fighting to control it. The voices we heard today, from Balint to Hageman, were not just debating policy. They were debating the soul of American governance. One side warned of a government retreating from its duty to defend citizens. The other warned of a government that had grown too powerful, too insulated, too far removed from the people it claims to serve. Somewhere between those warnings lies the fragile truth of a constitutional republic, and that truth demands vigilance. It demands that citizens pay attention not just to outcomes, but to processes, not just to who wins, but to how power is exercised. Because when oversight disappears, when accountability fades, it is never the powerful who suffer first. It is the ordinary people left without a voice in systems too complex and too distant to challenge. This hearing gave us more than sound bites. It gave us a stark reminder that the fight over agencies like the CFPB is really a fight over who controls the future of American governance. Whether it will be shaped by transparent, accountable institutions or by bureaucracies operating beyond the reach of those they affect. That is why moments like this matter. That is why these exchanges must be watched, understood, and remembered. The future of democratic accountability depends on it. If you believe in oversight, in constitutional balance, and in the right of citizens to know how power is used in their name, then stay with us. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA and support our work to expose the truth.